talk about what are the key points that we want these post-2015 agenda to do. It's a time historically to rethink the economic model that we are all living in, and I think it is a good thing for us to stop and take a moment to say, where do we want to go? But if we just go on the same track, we're in big trouble. So let me start by saying the gender, in terms of regarding gender, what are some of the key points that this new goal setting and framework should do? It has to include a human rights framework in terms of economic policy making. This is the United Nations. It's supposed to have this umbrella of human rights, but somehow that's off in some other corner, often in Geneva and not in New York. And we set development goals without human rights at the core as the basic normative framework by which economic policy has to be made. And that is not that complicated. It actually holds not just governments to account, but also the private sector to account. And I'll come back a little bit in terms of what is happening in terms of the private sphere. So when we talk about human rights, we need to talk about both civil and political rights, but economic, social, and cultural rights, and the indivisibility of both those sets of human rights. It has to look at the private sphere of the home, the family, as well as the public sphere of politics and the market. We need to look at equality of opportunity, which is often the focus, but we need to also look at the equality of outcome. It's not just opportunity, but it is of outcome. And if we don't look at that, then we've just sort of given a lot of bad opportunity for horrible outcomes. It requires a holistic approach, removing barriers to employment opportunities. I think something Dan had mentioned before, but we need to look at reducing gender gaps in political power, and it's not just about having more women at the table, but actually changing power relations. And so, just adding a few women into the political process doesn't mean that we're actually going to change. One thing that's really critical, I think, as we move forward, is to really look at the issue of unpaid work. We need to have unpaid work part of the discussion. We need to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid work. The MDGs have to look at equalizing up, not equalizing down, so that we don't want all men and women to have worse lives. We want everyone to have better lives. So when we talk about equalizing, we need to talk about equalizing up. And then in terms of looking at inequality, Sakiko have talked about inequality. We're living in a time of the highest level of global inequality between countries and within countries. And we're going towards this new 2015 agenda as though that doesn't sort of loom in the back, and that somehow by setting these goals, all of those issues are going to be dealt with. There has to be better data to look at inequality, both in terms of between countries, within countries, by race, ethnicity, gender, so that we can understand and make policies towards that. We have to look at distributive analysis on the following issues, such as access to food, sanitation, education, health services, and look at the gender dimensions and connect it to unpaid work in terms of having water be far away, and what does that do in terms of women's time spent on unpaid work. We need to look at structural inequalities in the labor market, such as gender segregation. We need to look at unequal distribution of resources and power between countries, with large countries with influence being able to make policy decisions and being told, other countries being told what they have to do. We also have to address the international trade and financial systems. We can't talk about post-2015 without those at the center of the discussion. We need to look at institutions such as the IMF, and Leanne's going to be happy, the G20. We have a whole G20 thing going on the side. The World Bank, I was just at a meeting yesterday on setting gender strategy goals for the World Bank. We need to make sure that those also question larger structural issues and not just sort of add gender and start. Trade policies in the WTO. Yesterday, we were at a Women's Coalition meeting, and someone said, we're setting these SDG goals that are not binding. And then there's the trade regimes that are binding, that are going to undermine every goal that the SDGs make, but we don't talk about those. So if we don't talk about both of those, then we're wasting an enormous amount of time and resources talking about these goals. Extreme wealth is a problem as much as extreme poverty, and we don't talk about that enough. And so when we talk about inequality, it's always trying to get the bottom up, but we need to talk about why is it that we live in a world of such huge levels of accumulation of wealth. By, you know, what I think it was, I mean, what is it, 8 people have the amount of resources as, you know, a majority of the world's population. Well, that's a systemic problem that we need to address. We need to look at employment, and here we need to look at creating and improving employment opportunities, including macroeconomic management to create those employment opportunities. We need to look at policies that raise the minimum remuneration of labor markets, such as minimum wage. And I have to say, and I know this is a UN Women session, but it would be horrible if I didn't mention this, but signing up with Uber for unpaid, for low-wage jobs around the world as part of employment creation is really disturbing. This is not what kind of employment women need. We need, you know, good jobs, decent jobs. The ILO has set this up, and hopefully we'll talk about this, but please put it on record that we don't like the Uber thing. UN Women, we don't like that. And then finally, in the last few minutes, I think we need to look at macroeconomic policies as part of a human rights framework. I mean, often economic policy is considered technical and human rights aspirational. They're not. They can be brought together. And I think, for example, the austerity programs around the world are violating the principle of non-retrogression, so we can look at all of these kind of economic policies within the human rights framework. The title of this conference is on governance, and we need to really look at governance at a very different level. And we need to look at financial regulation. We need to look at how we regulate the financialization of the world economy. The reason we're in trouble, we talk about the financial crisis and the ecological crisis and food crisis, they're all part of the same crisis of financialization of the world economy. And unless the governance goals are to regulate the world economy, we're going to end up in a much worse place 15 years from now. And we're still going to be chasing targets and indicators while the rest of the world falls apart. Sorry to be negative, but it's just, you know, I've been in the UN the last few days and the last month looking at these, you know, which indicator, where do we put gender? And meanwhile, the rest of the, you know, the private sector is taking over the agenda, and we're all chasing, you know, low levels jobs to drive our own cars and pick up people. And last is monitoring and accountability. We need to really set up an accountability framework that is from the ground up. And I think we need to have transparency. I mean, again, human rights goal, transparency, accountability, and participation means in economic policy making, not only, you know, as an afterthought at the end. And so we need to do that. And we need to talk about accountability, not just of states, but about the involvement of states with the private sector. I'll end there.
Thank you, Radhika. Well, I think you and Sakiko have really provided a terrific frame in which to then be discussing particular issue areas and points that you've raised. And why don't we start with Shauna, picking up on some of the comments that have already been made about paid and unpaid work. I think you're going to talk mostly about paid work, but we look forward to your perspective from the ILO.
Thank you very much. I've called my, can everyone hear me? I've called my presentation Paid Policies and Parenthood. Now, we've started with the first two speakers at a fairly high level in terms of what we need. I'm going to bring it right down, and I'm going to say the center of women's economic empowerment is money. Now, I'm a Canadian. We don't like to talk about money. But if we're going to lift women, if we're going to have gender equality, if we're going to have economic empowerment, we really, really have to talk about money. Now, I was at a meeting the other day with the Edge Foundation, and they were talking about research they did with Mercer, and looking at what are the key policies needed to have gender equality in a corporation, in a company. And she started out by saying, oh, it's a combination of policies. And wait a minute, it's a combination of policies. It's active management of talent. I went, okay, active management of talent. Never heard it before, but okay, active management of talent. And she said, what does that mean, active management of talent? It means pay equity. She said that is the single most important policy in a company for ensuring gender equality, for getting women at all levels, for getting a critical mass of women at all levels, 33%, and for getting women at the highest levels. It comes down to money. I thought, okay, well that's really good because that's what I want to talk about on Friday. So, we can look at pay equity at different levels, and obviously we have to look at the international commitment level, and we have incredible commitment at the international level. There's an ILO convention, an international treaty at the same level of international obligation as the covenants, as CEDAW, as the others. ILO conventions are treaties. We have a treaty on equal remuneration for work of equal value. 171 countries have signed up to that. They report on that at least every 3 years. And often, more often, if a trade union says, hey, we think there's a problem in this country about equal pay. So your independent body that supervises this, can you look at that country out of cycle? So it's a very regular monitoring system. Okay. Commitment is huge. 20 years ago, we had 126 countries that had signed up to that convention. We now have 126, yes, and we now have 171. So that's a 50% increase in the 20 years since Beijing. Commitment is really high. Implementation is not so high, and there are real issues of implementation. The big issue that comes back over and over again is, what do we mean by work of equal value? And I think there we've still got some work to do. ILO has done a global wage report about a month ago. We released the findings. Very interesting in terms of explained and unexplained wage gap, parts of the wage gap. We looked at gender, so we looked at women and men. We looked at migrant workers and national workers, and we looked at informal economy and formal economy. Now what we haven't done yet, and I think this is the next stage, is crossed all that data. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the wage gap part of it for gender. Okay? When we talk about the explained part, we're talking about experience, education, occupational category, etc. The human capital. Now, even in the explained part, it's pretty clear there's discrimination as well. But we're separating that out and we're saying, okay, we can explain wage differences to a certain extent by these factors. Because we often hear, well, you don't understand. You know, women want to work shorter hours. Women don't want good jobs. Women don't have the same education. Women don't have the same experience. Well, nonsense. They do, in a lot of cases. And if we start actually looking at that data, we can start responding to those questions and those issues. When we have the unexplained part, we call it a wage penalty. Okay, and that's very much the clear discriminatory part. So let's look at some of the data. Now, the light purple part is the interesting part, because that's the unexplained part. Okay? These are just representative. I'm not going to give you all the examples we have, but I think these ones are quite representative. So if you look at Belgium, explained part at the lowest decile is pretty high. Okay? So a lot of that is around education and experience. Okay? The explained part. The explained part becomes much lower at the highest decile. So the higher you are in the wage system, the more wage discrimination there is. And we see that in terms of the gender pay gap generally, that the gender pay gap goes up as you go up in the pay system. So not only do we have a dearth of women at the top, when they get there, they're discriminated against even more in terms of pay. So I think we've got a big problem there that we need to look at. Now, if you look at Chile, this one's quite interesting, because you see, if you take into account the explained pay gap at the top 3 deciles, women should in fact be earning more than men. If you take into account education and experience and those other factors. So the people that come to you and say, "Oh, but they don't have the same experience, they don't have the same education," nonsense. We're now getting data that shows that that's not true. And in fact, you'll find that for men, if they've got experience in education, their pay goes way up. For women, experience actually doesn't count for as much. That's where we're not getting the same credit as men, is on experience. So don't let anyone tell you that women, it's because we don't have the same experience. We're just not getting the same credit for it. Okay? So I think this data is quite interesting in terms of the policy responses that we need to take. Just some more here. You'll see some other upside down ones. Sweden, Russian Federation, women should be earning more. We've got a whole chart in the report on the global wage report. It's on our website. So if you want to see it, there's a number of different figures like this that are quite interesting.